Welcome to the first of the Alliance Open Dial events, and a special welcome to all our members and media friends from across the world. I'm Ricky from the Scottish Watches podcast, and I'm going to be here today to, well, kind of take you through everything that's going on today. As you probably are no doubt aware, we've got Roger Smith, who is not only one of the co-founders of the Alliance, but also one of the world's best known, best loved, and well respected watchmakers. He's going to be here with us today. Not just to go through what's happening with the Alliance, but a whole load of other things as well. And we'd also like to thank our sponsor for the Open Dial series, that is A Collected Man. To give you some information of who they are, for anybody that doesn't know, The Collected Man's a platform to discover the rare side of horology, from independent timepieces to intriguing collectibles and everything else in between. They have built a platform which takes everything from the far corners of the watch world, and they deliver them all through listings and articles on their website. We'll talk a little bit more about that later on as well. Naturally, our priority with this has been safety. That's why we're not in a studio setting. I'm at home. You might hear an ice cream van if you've heard my podcast before. That is a familiar hearing. We've also got Roger. He's at home as well due to the COVID restrictions that are currently in place both in the UK and across in the Isle of Man. That being said, there might be some glitches because we're using 4G and our Wi-Fi connections. It's not exactly commercial grade quality. So if anything happens, if you can bear with us, that'd be appreciated. Lots in store tonight, lots of videos, lots of pre-recorded stuff, and we're going to have lots of questions and answers from the audience. So if you're listening, you're watching, you're on your phone, you're on your tablet, you're on your PC at home, if you check out the little box that should be beside what you're viewing just now, you can drop in a question, anything to do with the Alliance, anything to do with what Roger's doing, George Daniels, or horology in general. Don't ask anything about Scottish Watches podcast because I'm not here to hype that up today. Yeah, we'll be taking questions throughout, and there are some special things happening later on as well. I'm not going to talk too much about that just now, but you're just going to have to hang around. And if you can stay past the official closing time, which is 6 o'clock, there's going to be some behind the scenes information from Roger that we haven't even announced yet. So yeah, I think that really sort of covers things. We're going to start off proceedings. I'm just trying to coax things along here because people haven't joined exactly on time. People always run late, even though they're into the world of watches. So we're going to start off with a video, and that is with George Daniels. Let me just check and see if everybody is in. Everybody seems to be checking in. Yep. So we're going to go for a video all about George Daniels' room, and we'll check that out and we'll come back and we'll chat to you shortly.
So welcome to George's workshop. For me, this is a very special place. This is, I suppose, the room that inspired me, the equipment that inspired me, but it's also the person behind that equipment, George Daniels. And he had a very remarkable approach to watchmaking. It's an approach that he began in the late sort of 1960s, about 67, 68, he started building up to his big moment when he decided to build his very first pocket watch, which he completed in 1969. And what was so unusual about George was that he built a complete watch from scratch. He took the raw materials and he built every single component in that watch. And he ended up with a completely individual, unique pocket watch. But his key sort of focus throughout his career was to improve mechanical timekeeping. And his focus throughout that whole period was to improve on the escapements that were driven, that were being used in all mechanical watches. And his ultimate accolade was the invention of the coaxial escapement, which is the very heart of my business today. So I remember whenever we had visiting journalists to the Riversdale studio with George, he would always tell them that all he needed was a germ of an idea, and then he'd come down to this very workshop, lock himself away for 1 year, and then come out with a completely original pocket watch. And he would always start this sort of build of these pocket watches by doing a dial design. And he always used to say to me that the most important feature of any watch is the dial, the hands, and then the case. If you don't get the dial right, then it just simply won't work. And you must remember that the dial of any watch is the most important part of it, because it's the main feature that the client will look at, the owner will look at day in, day out. And so the dial has to be very legible, very clear. And what he would do would be to design the dial layout. And by doing that, he could work out the various features that he needed to appear on the dial. So for example, this one here has a minutes and hours, seconds, a temperature gauge, and then a power reserve gauge. And from that design, it would then give him the key features where the information from the mechanism behind would come through the dial to display the information. So if you look at this next drawing, then this is how he would work out the basic design layout for the watch mechanism, because he now has those key features that he can then, if you like, drill back into the mechanism. So these three sketches here are of a movement plate which are twice the full size. And what he's done here is worked out the gear ratios and the diameters in order to be able to display that information on the dial. And that's key. And then from there, what he can then do, what he's done here is just to design the very basic look of the plates and the bridges that go into the pocket watch. And this particular design is the basis for his double wheel escapement pocket watches, which we all know in the Space Traveller #1 and the Space Traveller #2, which was his great watch for timing phone calls to and from Mars and so on. So there are very few drawings completed by George, and the very simple reason is because George only ever had himself to work with. He would just design a watch like this and then come and sit at this very bench here and just make the watch. As I say, there were very few drawings. It was all in his head. He could work it out. He could see the watch three-dimensionally, and he'd just pick up these various tools and start fashioning the mechanism from there. And as I said, often taking anywhere from a year to 18 months, depending on the complexity of the piece. So this particular bench, this was in George's workshop. This lowest section was actually built by a student, and is built for George by the student and delivered to him. Interestingly, this top section, which is loose, I brought this from my workshop in Bolton, and I built my first 2 watches on this. And I knew that the bench here would be too low for me. I'm very used to working on a higher bench, whereas George always worked on very low benches. That's probably why I had a bad back. But anyway, I brought this and I put this on top of this bench and worked away building the Millennium watches for, it's just over about 3 years that I worked with George on this. And then here we have George's drawing table or drafting table. And this was very good. Nowadays, everyone uses computers, but in those days, it was all basically pencils and paper. And this is where George would design his watches, do the basic designs for his watches, but also he would do the illustrations of his work for the art of Breguet and so on. So here we have George's, what he used to call his jeweling bench. And again, he had this raised section here and his various jeweling tools and so on. He also had his staking sets on there. And then in the shelves just to the side, full selection of jewels, Sykes jewels, which he used to use in his watches. And yeah, he always liked to have a dedicated area for a particular task in the workshop. And actually, I always used to describe it as a watchmaking industry under one roof. Basically, you could walk into this room, this building with an idea, and he wouldn't have to leave it because he'd have all his case making equipment, wheel making, screw making, the full works he could do within this workshop. So moving on, this is the main bench that he sat at. Again, is very low compared to modern standards. And this is, again, probably why I had a bad back. But again, what was already very unique was the way that George worked, and he had this two-stage, two-level way of working. He would build his watch here, and then things like his tools would be stored around this area and just scattered around. Not very hygienic and clean the way we tend to work today, but that's just the way George liked it, and he used it all to great effect. His drawers here were again just full of, as they were really, just full of old tools and so on. Just interesting bits and pieces. And then across the back of the bench, he'd have all his hand tools. And these were really very important because these are the tools that he'd use to grip the small pieces of metal that he'd then be able to fashion and file into shape to make these various components for his watches. So a huge array of tools, but tools which are still readily available from sort of second-hand shows and so on. This was his graveyard, what he always referred to as graveyard, and actually is a real fascinating insight into the way George worked. And if you have a route around here, you'll find discarded coaxial escape wheels. This was a prototype case that I made with George for the Millennium project that we both worked on. The prototype that we worked out, the aesthetics and so on for the watch, is very important always to make a prototype. And various barrel arbors and fixed fourth wheels for tourbillon watches and so on, all with a fault. Interesting just to look through, and again, you get a sense of how the man worked. And then moving on, we'd have his death trap of a demagnetizer. I wouldn't dare use that today, it'd probably kill me. And then onto a drill. This was one of the drills that George used. There were a couple that he had, but this is a very sort of basic type of drill which takes a 6mm collet. And then here we have the coaxial escapement, the model that was presented to him by Omega. I remember this clock being on the wall when I arrived in the workshop to visit George in 1989. And I remember this very, very loud tick with the seconds hand turning round. And George used to use this for regulating, for monitoring all of the pocket watches that he made to make sure that they were keeping time to this precision time, which he was always trying to achieve. And today, sadly, the clock isn't working. And this is why it's just set at the usual 10:10. But it's something I need to get around to fixing someday. So on this L-shaped bench, it's now sort of got mixed use. We put George's timing machines on it, whereas when he was using it, he'd have another watchmaker's lathe there, and then a lathe he'd use for cutting jewels and so on. Any unusual jewel that he needed to cut, he would cut on the lathe, but I can show you that later. On the back shelf here, we have the pivot fixes, which are brilliant tools, and we use those today for burnishing the pivots for all of our watches. They're very good because they're repeatable, and you can set them up for a particular size and then do a run of pivots if you're making several watches at once. In the corner there, we have his wheel that he used to use for polishing the pinions. You just connect that to a motor from a watchmaker's lathe. And then here are the two timing machines which he used to use for the timing of his coaxial escapements and so on. And then we have these balance poising tools here, which are actually more commercial. These are something which he picked up in Switzerland many, many years ago. I'm unsure as to whether he used it. I doubt very much if he ever actually used them. But they're very impressive looking bits of equipment. And then here we have the lathe which we used to use for cutting the dials for the Millenniums on. And I used to sit here at this bench and cut away those chapter rings and so on for the Millennium project. And there's no doubt about it. I mean, the equipment that George had was very, very well equipped workshop. He spent his lifetime collecting and building this workshop. And so for me, is just like an Aladdin's cave, really. of equipment, and everything was to hand and everything was super quality. And it's just wonderful to be able to work on this particular type of equipment. And so that concludes the tour of the George Daniels workshop collection. And so now we can move into my workshop and we'll show you how we build our watches.
So there we go. I hope you guys enjoyed that. It was nice to have a look around there, see a couple of the interesting sites, and hopefully you guys picked up a few things there if you haven't already seen some photographs and video content of that before. But it's time to speak to the man of the hour. Roger is here live and in person, virtually online. How are things going over in Isle of Man just now?
All good, thank you, Ricky. Very nice to see you again.
Yes, it's a shame it couldn't be in person. It's a shame we couldn't be in the studio, but matters have been taken out with our hands, as has happened for the last 365 days almost. But good to see you virtually. Your 4G connection is holding up, I see.
Just about. You know, we're on tender hooks here, but we hope will survive to the end of the event.
Excellent. Well, as is customary when we do videos or we do podcasts at Scottish Watches, we always like to find out what somebody has got on the wrist, and I can't even imagine what you've pulled out of the drawer today to show us. So what have you got on the wrist?
Well, not on the wrist, but this is an early watch. In fact, this is a very early watch. This is the very first Series 2 prototype wristwatch that I made. And this was completed in February of 2006. And this was the very first, I suppose it's the very first production wristwatch to have been made for, well, since the closure of Smith's watches back in the sort of 70s and 80s, really. So yeah, it's a very important watch to me and something which we treasure in the workshop.
Very nice. I did see up your sleeve there. Is there not another watch somewhere hiding?
There is. Oh, there is the usual, I'm afraid.
What one's that today?
The Explorer, the Rolex Explorer.
Nice.
Yeah.
Right. Well, I'm wearing my favourite British watch brand as well. So I've got the Rolex GMT Master 2. Known as the Batman, it's a BLNR. My favourite watch. It's the watch that kind of got me into the hobby and started my journey down, going to Basel World and then ending up speaking to you and obviously Mike France last year, talking about the Alliance and everything there. A couple of questions I've got personally, which is out with what we've been asked to do here because I'm in control. I'm going to sort of take the stage for a little bit. How have things been over in the Isle of Man the last sort of couple of months with the lockdown? How you managed to progress things? Because obviously over here in the UK, things are a little bit more tense, more difficult. You've had a little bit more leeway. How's it been for you guys at the workshop?
Yeah, I mean, it's been okay. I mean, we have fared better than you guys unfortunately have over in the UK, but we've been okay. Last year was very sort of clear and we were able to get on with our lives. After Christmas, there's a 3-week circuit break lockdown on the island because there'd been a rise in cases, and that, you know, we sailed through that. We were able to carry on working because fortunately the workshop is large enough to be able to spread out and distance and so on. So we're taking all the right precautions there. And then we got back into normal life. All the restrictions were lifted. And then just a week ago, the restrictions had to be brought in because there's been a bit of a spike in cases on the island. So we're just coming up to, I think, the end of week 1 and anticipated another 2 weeks, but who knows. But again, fortunately, we're able to carry on working, which is a huge relief to me.
Good. Well, the most important question I've really got to ask, you might know about this, is the TT going ahead this year?
It isn't.
Oh,
It's
right, okay.
cancelled last year, and it's going to be cancelled this year, obviously. It's a great shame, particularly because the bikes used to come across the end of the lane where the workshop is, and it's very exciting time. But sadly not, Ricky. Sadly not.
Mixing my two favourite hobbies together, unfortunately, not going to happen again this year. Well, going to the questions that we've had, as I mentioned earlier, if you want to jump on the website, depending how you're viewing this just now, there is an area, hopefully beside this video, where you can type in any questions you've got regarding George Daniels, the Alliance, Roger, or horology in general. So pop your questions in there and we will try and get through as many of them as we can. We have a couple to go with to start. Let's see. This is an amalgam of various different questions that have come in from different people, but basically the question is, What was a typical day working with George like?
It was always, well, it was an early start. George was a very early riser. I'm not as early as George, but I basically arrived at the workshop about 8 o'clock in the morning, opened up, got everything going. If it was winter, I switched on the heaters because it's a very cold workshop, got everything warmed up and ready for the day ahead. It really depended on what sort of stage of the project we were at as to how involved George was. Certainly in the early months, the early sort of 9 months, he was in all the time and guiding me through the workshop and putting in the foundations with me to build the Millennium series of wristwatches. So it was, yeah, I mean, it's very relaxed. It was, George was surprisingly easygoing, and his his tuition whenever I needed it was second to none. It was a complete surprise to me, partly because he did come with he had a bit of a reputation, and I think that reputation was really built on the fact that he didn't suffer fools. And I suppose if he was working with somebody who he felt he could get on with and who listened, then is great. And yeah, we got on. We also had our moments, as anyone will do, working closely together. But no, it's all good, all really good.
Right, and one of those moments might have been when you first showed him a couple of your creations and he said they were poop.
Yes, the very first pocket watch. I mean, obviously, I think that story is very well known, but yes, it wasn't a highlight of my career, put it that way. And George, I mean, I can visualize it, as if it's only yesterday, but the look on his face said it all. And he was less than pleased about the quality of the work. I mean, he did rally towards the end of the meeting, and he said, well, congratulations, you made a watch which works. But really it's now up to me to go away and try and perfect these 33 skills which are required to completely make a complete pocket watch by hand. And that's what I did. I just had to disappear and put that watch down to experience and really sort of start again and start the second watch.
Yeah. So looking at more questions that have come in here, what would you say are the key differences then in the approach between yourself and the way George would work on things?
Well, I mean, George, he generally liked to work on his own. I mean, I think he did have one or two people, I think, for brief periods, early on in his sort of making career in the sort of early 70s and so on. But after that, I mean, he generally liked to work on his own. And I think that was just George. He didn't want to be burdened with employing people. He didn't want to be burdened with the running of a business, which it suddenly becomes as soon as there's more than one person there. So yeah, he just had a focus. He had this incredible focus to change watchmaking, and he didn't want anyone to get in his way, anyone to stop that. And it was only later on in his life when I obviously joined him in 1998, when I think he got to a position in life where, I suppose, probably in a more reflective mood. He was at that point working with Amiga to help them to industrialize his coaxial escapement.
Yeah.
And he wanted a watch. He wanted to make a series of watches built around the very early base calibers, to showcase his coaxial escapement. So is a different time in his life. I think he's more open to getting help and support that at the age of 72, he obviously needed.
Yeah. Okay. Good answers. We have a lot more questions coming in. Guys, keep them coming throughout. We want to try and get through as many as possible. But before we do that, we're going to take a little bit of a tour with Roger. bit of a virtual tour this time. So if you guys want to sit back, relax, and we'll run that.
So welcome to the machine room. This is where we do a lot of the machining of the components that go into our watches. And we'll use these to rough out all of the basic components of a watch, because as I say, we need that high precision in order to achieve the really high tolerances that I expect of my watches. So in this room, this is the middle room of the workshop. This is where a lot of the finishing takes place. So what I'm trying to show you is a step-by-step tour around the workshop. So the first room we've just been in, the machine room, that's where all the raw components are made, the high precision raw components that are needed for my watches are made. In this room, this is where those components are brought, and the watchmakers start to handle them at this point. And they'll start to harden and temper those components, and then start doing a lot of the finishing and preliminary assembling and any turning that may need to be done on those components. That'll all be done in this room. So this is the jeweler's bench, which I mentioned to you before. We use it to do some polishing on and so on with of small components with this sort of wheel. But this was what George used to alter some of his jewels for some of his earlier pocket watches. Again, a high precision drill. This is a very good Italian pillar drill. Again, this was one of George's pieces of equipment. And actually, interestingly, these benches here, these were a gift to George and his wife, Julie. They were a wedding gift from the owner of the Versatile Bench Company. So a nice bit of history. Moving over to this bench, we have this Bowley F1 lathe. This is one that I bought probably about 15 years ago now. It's a wonderful lathe because it's so small, it's so mobile. If you're turning very small components, you can move it to any position to make it easier to get your hands around when you're turning the components. And it's just a great, versatile little lathe. This next lathe, this was George's, and this would have been sat on that L-shaped bench that I mentioned earlier. It's more substantial than the previous lathe. It has these two pillars here, what's called twin pedestal, or two pillars. You know, and this just gives the whole lathe lots of rigidity. It's a lot stiffer, and it's just for those components which may be a little bit larger. Again, when you get to this scale, the compound slide is starting to become practical and can be used for various components. Again, it's not a heavy weight. You wouldn't do any considerable turning on that. But nevertheless, for very small components, it can be very, very good. But a wonderful lathe, really brilliant, no wear on it at all. It's obviously been knocked around a bit, but so do all these old bits of equipment. So moving over to this bench here, we have this Chauvelin 70 lathe, and this was one of George's original lathes. It's fitted with this dividing head, which we will use for some gear cutting, wheel cutting, or just any sort of small components. And it means the dividing head, you can basically set this head up to step this headstock around in set divisions for teeth and so on. And again, you know, these Chauvelin 70 lathes are a brilliant toolmaker's lathe, very high precision. And again, you know, with a compound slide like this, you can turn anything up to 8 mil very comfortably. There's plenty of power there. Moving over here, this is the Chauvelin 70 lathe that I bought, or my father lent me some money when I was thinking about making or wanting to make my very first pocket watch back in, I think it must have been about the 1990. This was after seeing George, after visiting George. You know, I realised that if I was going to be able to make a pocket watch, I had to have a very good, high quality lathe. And so I was fortunate that my father lent me some money to buy this lathe. And here we are many years later, and it's still going very strong, but a really good lathe that's been the basis of all my work to date. Swinging around here, we have these two bits of equipment, which are all the engine turning equipment that we require for our watches. They're both about just over 200 years old, and they were restored, brought back to new condition, and they were, gave George that real flexibility in the ability to make his own complete watches. And he had to teach himself how to engine turn. Again, by the time George was becoming interested in engine turning, the engine turning fraternity had virtually disappeared within Britain. So it was up to George to relearn these skills in order for him to be able to engine turn his dials and his cases. This particular machine is called a rose engine, and the reason for its name is these set of roses here. And each of these roses has a different pattern. And depending on which pattern you choose, it'll replicate that pattern onto the dial or the case, that style, that length of weave or whatever. This is basically used to produce any radial pattern, any circular pattern on a dial or a case. And its operation is very simple. You have your work holding here, your dial will be held here. This will rotate using this handle here. And as it rotates, the whole head will move back and forth past this cutter here. And it's this cutter which is critical. You have to have very good, steady thumb pressure on this cutter here in order to get a very good depth of cut on the work that you're doing. The piece of equipment over here is a straight line engine, and we get the name obviously because it creates any straight line pattern that you may have on your dial. And these two pieces of equipment took me a long time to learn how to use. Basically, George set me up in his workshop with a big pile of silver squares and told me to start making these dials. And after obviously some preliminary sort of teaching, but it's something which you just have to get used to. And there are so many settings. So after every single cut, you will have to reset these various settings on the compound slide and so on. So it's very complex, and it takes a real attention to detail in order to get a really high quality engine turn dial. So this is the second of George's Chauvelin 70s lathe. And again, a brilliant lathe. George always had two lathes, and the reason for that was because you could do some preliminary machining on one lathe, and then he has various assemblies which enable you to take a complete assembly out of one lathe and then put it into the other one for its second or third operation. And again, that was key to George's success. He had this great flexibility between all of his pieces of equipment. And there's no better way to explain it than on this piece of equipment here. So this is a Hauser jig borer. Again, this piece was bought just before I arrived in the workshop so we could work on the Millennium projects. And again, the setup of this allows you to do some work on a particular component. You may have been working on it in the Chauvelin lathe, but then you can lift that whole assembly out, bring it to this jig borer and mount it on the front here, and then that'll enable you to do, again, the second, third, fourth stage of making that component. So, interestingly, this jig borer is a high precision drilling and milling machine. And this is a manually operated piece of equipment which is very similar to the red machines which I just showed you in the previous room. All this is, they are as accurate as each other, but this is just manually operated. And you can use this to great effect in wristwatch making because you're able to work to 2 to 3 thousandths of a millimeter. So a very important piece of kit, particularly if anybody's wanting to make one-off individual watches. So this was a great piece of equipment. I used it a lot throughout the Millennium projects, and then also the building of the first 2 Daniels wristwatches. And then I started to use it on my very first Series 1 wristwatch, which I started making in 2001. And that was my first attempt at making a wristwatch on my own. So a great piece of kit, very fond of it, and very, very versatile, but all manual. So that's the challenge. You don't get the repeatability. If I make a mistake on something like this, then hours, days of work could just be ruined. Over here we have a heating hearth, and we use this for many, many things. Everything from removing glue from components that we've been making. We can gently warm the component and the glue will just peel away. We use it for heat treatment of all our components. And what we'll usually do is we'll have tool jigs like this, which we will put charcoal inside. We'll put the components with another layer of charcoal on top. Then we'll heat it up to a cherry red. And then when it's glowing, nice and glowing, we'll just tap the contents out into the water or oil, depending on what sort of heat treatment or hardness you're wanting in the component. And after that, we'll then do the annealing, the tempering of the metal. Because when you harden and temper steels, they become very hard, very brittle, and so they can snap. So what you then have to do is just heat up the component, usually to about a blue, which is about 270 degrees, and that'll just relax some of the molecules, allowing you to have flex in that component. So very useful, but very difficult sort of area to work in because it's so precise and there are no gauges or temperatures, it's just all off experience when you're trying to harden and temper individual components. So it takes a long time to learn how to heat treat a component very well, and get the correct hardness throughout it. We also use this area for soldering dials together, and also for bleaching of the dials, the producing of this white silver oxide on the dials. And then over here we have our comparator. This is a comparator I bought in 2001, and I'd saved up a bit of spare cash when I was working with George, and I suddenly found myself in a position where I had to build a small workshop in the house I was then living at. Now that I was moving into wristwatches, I needed something accurate in order to be able to make those wristwatches. So I bought this comparator, which enables you to basically put an image, or put a component on the base here, and then the pattern, the profile of it will then be reflected onto this screen here. This has got a 50 times lens at the moment. You can see it's very close. And then you're able to measure, again, to thousandths of a millimeter. And this was so critical for me in those early days when I was building my Series 1 wristwatches, because I needed that reassurance that I was making the plates for those watches, to the 2 to 3 thousandths of a millimeter that I needed. And so this was a great piece of tool, and just enabled me to get a foot into wristwatch making. Actually, just reminded me here, because we're going to be talking about the coaxial escapement, and this is a good way of demonstrating the key differences between the coaxial escapement and the lever escapement. So I delivered a talk over a year ago now. I came up with this idea of a man and a door, and how to explain the key differences in the way power is transmitted through to the balance wheel. So in a lever escapement, if you imagine that my hand is a tooth and that this door is a jewel, what you have, in order to deliver impulse to that jewel, you have a tooth that lands on the jewel, and then it slides down the door face or the jewel face, imparting its energy. But the problem is with that action is that you have a lot of sliding friction there, and that sliding friction needs to be lubricated. But the problem is when you lubricate anything, like your car or your watch, eventually as the oil thickens, it'll become harder for that tooth to slide down that jewel face and deliver the impulse. And so that's when the timekeeping of your watch starts to deteriorate. So what George did, what he did with the coaxial escapement, was he created an escapement where the impulse is delivered through a simple pushing action. And so if we have a tooth here and a jewel, which is the door, again, what we just have is the tooth hits the door or the jewel and simply pushes it away. It just pushes it away. There is no real sliding friction. And that is how the power is delivered in a coaxial escapement. And because there's no real sliding friction of the hand or the tooth down the door face or the jewel face, it means that you have a higher degree of accuracy for a far longer period of time. And that's the beauty and the great benefit to having a coaxial escapement fitted into your wristwatch. So here we are in the final room, the main assembly room, and this is where the individual watches are built. In here, the watchmakers will all have their own watch. They'll have a kit given to them of a complete watch mechanism, and then it's up to the watchmaker to take those raw components to build them up into a complete watch. And that can be a process which can take anything from, I mean, it depends on the complexity, but the completion of a complete watch can take anywhere from 10 months up to 12, 13 months, depending on the complexity of the watch. Very, very labour intensive. But the watchmaker's sort of sole responsibility is the building of the complete mechanism. And it'll go in several different stages. So first of all, the watchmaker will pre-finish certain components. At this stage, the plates will still have been unfinished. They'll be still have their nickel, they're made of nickel silver, so they'll still be in their raw state. And the watchmaker will have assembled all the different components. They'll make sure that the watch is working well, that the escapement is functioning correctly, that the timekeeping is brought to a reasonable level. It's at that point that the watchmaker will then completely strip the watch down and then start to do all the final finishing and assembly. And at that point, the plates will be gold plated and chatons finished and polished, and all the steel work will receive its final black polish. And right at the very end, the timekeeping will be brought to time. The watch will be made to keep time. It's a very, very long process. We're only making, I think, about 14 pieces this year, and so very, very labour intensive, but very rewarding. So if we can introduce you to Sean, and Sean is in charge of building the Daniels watches at the moment. So perhaps, Sean, you can show us what you're doing. You've got a couple of Daniels on the benches.
Yes, this is one that's approaching its final stages of the build. So most of the components are finished to quite a high standard. Some of them are gold plated, and this is probably the last build I'll make before stripping it down completely and then giving it its final gold plating. So you see the variety of colours there. When that's finished, it'll be a beautiful sort of uniform gold. Steel components in the Daniels style are given a grained finish, as opposed to the Roger Smith finish, which is usually a black polish. So you can see various things like the seconds drive here, the calendar works here, and that's part of the up and down works. And that's the movement side, which is the view given through the sapphire case back. And there's components like gold balance clock here, which is still in its heat treated finish. It's been tidied up, but that'll be a beautiful polish when that's done. So I think I'm probably about 7 months into the build of this watch, and that probably has another month to go at least before it's cased up and the hands and dial are ready. I'll show you one that's pretty much ready for casing up. This one's just been sat on my bench, and it's been I've been winding it up and seeing how it's been performing. And because it's been on my bench for a little while, it will have a final clean and a finish, just to spruce it up a little bit more. But that's more or less how it will look when it's cased up. So you see that the balanced cock has had its finish, so it's beautiful and shiny. The grained pallet cock, and the screws have been given their final bluing, and most of the components are there on the dial side. So that's one that's going to be going to the customer once it's cased up and tested. And yeah, that's pretty much what I'm up to at the moment.
Very good. So Jonathan here has got 2 watches which we can show and demonstrate how we build our watches. So the first watch is this Series 1 wristwatch, which is in here. And this is in its preliminary stages of being built. Jonathan will have hardened and tempered a lot of the components, put a preliminary finishing on there, and he's just building up the various stages of the watch in order to bring it to time, in order to get it ticking. So that's the first stage, unfinished stage. Chatons are fitted, plates are still unplated, and so on. So that's the first stage. Second stage of building a watch is this, and this is an open dial wristwatch which is being built. And as you can see, the plates have been gold plated. This one has had some unique engraving done on the barrel bridge there. And this is now in the early stages of having the components polished. So we've got chatons polished there. All this steel work here, if you notice, has now been black polished, which is an incredible labour-intensive way of finishing watches. And it's hugely demanding and can take sometimes days, or certainly hours, sometimes days, to achieve the correct finish that we really look for in a watch. A lot of these other components are still in need of some more finishing, but basically another couple of weeks and this watch will be coming together and ready for its final timing. If you see the hands have had their final finishing there, they're made of steel and blued steel, and they've been polished and so on and blued. And we have this sort of flame bluing which produces a sort of purple blue hue to the components. So that's the sort of stage where we're at with these 2 watches. So it's a good opportune time to have come into the workshop and to have seen how we build up our different types of watches. So we'll just be chatting to Ed now, and Ed is busy building the Series 4 wristwatches. We've got one which is in an early stage of, well, it's been assembled, and Ed will be bringing that to time shortly. We've got a finished watch here which is on test, and then Ed's now working on some phases of moon. So if you could hand over there, if you could talk through those, Ed, that'd be wonderful.
Yes.
Thank you.
Oh, so as Roger stated earlier, we've got one here that's been built up, it's functional. It just needs the moon phase parts fitted now. And so we're just waiting for some bits to be made, and then I'll get that fitted and working. And then this one is very near to completion. It's just on test. And I'm just letting the watch run through, do a few date changes. It's gone and done quite a few at the moment, to be honest. I want to make sure that it all works. And then I'll swap the day and month discs for the nice new ones, the decorated ones, and that'll be ready for casing up and further testing before it goes to the client. And then while I'm watching those tick over, I'm in the process of doing the moon wheels. So I'll start off with a rough piece like this, and then I get a 3-prong punch, and I will punch some star shapes into it. And then I get some gold, I turn some gold down, and rivet it onto the steel piece. And then I face all the metal off, black polish it down, and then I'll flame blue it, much like the screws that Roger likes. So then we keep the stars, the gold will turn down into the star shape, and then you've got nice blue steel, nice gold stars, and they will hold the moons and go on the moon wheel that you can see on this caliber here. So all in all, this will probably take me a few days just to do one, but it's worth it.
And so this is where I work. This is my sort of take on George's bench. We still have these split level heights of the benches, but overall the whole bench is a lot higher and conforming more with sort of modern working heights and so on. But my work varies a lot, obviously, because I'm involved in the designing of the watches, the prototyping of the watches, and so on. So I'm not spending all my days at the bench. A lot of the time I can be spent designing watches and so on. But then when we get into the prototype phase, I become involved and I'm back at the bench helping to build the very first prototype, ironing out any issues that we may have, and then I'll get it to a stage where we can then pass it on to the other watchmakers. But at the moment, my work is I'm in between everything else. I'm trying to finish a couple of Series 1 wristwatches, but it's just very varied and very fluid, and it has to be because of the nature of the business. But we have a wonderful team here. There's 12 people here in total, and it really is, for me, it's very exciting to be in this business and to be working with these people and building these very unusual, very rare watches.
And we're back. Now, just a quick reminder, because a lot of people have joined this broadcast since we started, some latecomers, how dare you, you're supposed to be into watches, know about timekeeping. But because of the COVID restrictions in place, both here in the UK and across the Isle of Man, the connection might be a little bit iffy at points. We're using 4G with Roger, and depending if people in his house are playing different kind of games and watching YouTube videos, it might drop in and out. So just bear with us. That being said, we have an absolute ton of questions coming in across the night. And if you've got ones that you want to ask, be sure to drop them in on the website. But it's time to get busy. Oh, one last thing. Because we're working from home, my neighbours are getting laminate flooring fitted, so things might go a little bit crazy, just so you know. But let's start with the questions. We've got a ton to go through, and we've got one here from Matthew Hobbs. His question is, in your view, what innovation is left to be introduced in traditional watchmaking?
Gosh, that's a very interesting one. And if I knew, I probably wouldn't tell you anyway, because I'd be saving it for my own work. That's a very big question. I mean, certainly the nanotechnology that we're working on, that's, you know, I think is hugely important. And as we all know, the wristwatch's biggest problem is the oil that lubricates it. And if you can go some way to removing that, then that would be a huge step forward, not only for the watch, but also for the user of the watch. As we all know, watches can be expensive to service, and if we can somehow reduce that cost or remove that cost, then wouldn't that be great for the end user? So yeah, that's where I'm at the moment. Yeah.
If only there was a technology that would remove the reliance of lubricants. Maybe you can work on something like that. Next question we have is from Brendan, and he asks, when a watch you've made comes back in for service, do you recognise it, and how does that feel?
Certainly do. Yeah, and it's always interesting because you know, they tell a story as to where we were at that point. And since we started, or since I made the very first Series 2 back in 2006, and now we're on the 100th piece. So there's a story to be told with all those watches. And it certainly is interesting to see where we were technically, where our skill levels were. So yeah, it's a wonderful reminder, and often you can tell which watchmaker may have worked on that watch by the finishing, by the size of the bevels, by the black polishing, the quality of the black polishing, and so on. So yeah, they all have a story to tell. So it's, yeah, hugely interesting.
Excellent. They're coming thick and fast. This one here is anonymous. You do not have to tell us who you are. We'll still ask your questions if they're relevant. When designing a new watch and you have a blank dial, do you look only at it cosmetically, or are there ratios you traditionally follow to help it look balanced?
So yeah, I mean, designing a dial is a huge job. I mean, it's one of the most important features of any watch because it's what the owner spends his time looking at. So there aren't any set ratios that I have written down. I can't open a book and tell you those ratios. It's really just a matter of designing a dial to display the features, making sure that those features are coherently set out on the dial and very clearly set out on the dial. And then it's just a gut feeling really as to whether, you know, that dial is balanced, whether it sort of just looks right. And it's certainly interesting that when you are designing a dial, just shaving off, I mean, I do my design work on a SolidWorks 3D sort of package. And it is interesting, you can shave off maybe a 500th of a millimeter from the weight, from the size of the numerals, and it'll make all the difference to the dial. So you really sort of detail into these sort of minutiae of design and balance, and it's a big job, but something I'm still learning.
Yep, every day is a school day. I thought you used MS Paint for all your design work. Yeah, I suppose people were talking there about like golden ratios, Fibonacci sequences, things like that that are used in design. Next question we've got is from Scott. He says, the workshop is so much bigger than I pictured. How many people are working there on a given day, and how many watches are being made at any given time? Thanks.
So yes, the workshop is, we completed that about 3 years ago. And prior to that, we were working in the first house I bought when I moved to the Isle of Man. This current workshop is, I think it's about 3,500 square feet. There's ample space, which has paid dividends during this whole COVID situation. The number of people we have is 12. I'm hesitating because we have one guy who's hopefully going to be starting next week with us. He's currently isolating on the island, and I think it's next week, middle of next week, when he's joining us, so that'll be exciting. And then the number of watches, again, it can vary on the year depending on the complexity of the watches that we have to make that year, but anywhere between 13, 14 pieces. Next year, I think we have 15 scheduled in. So it just depends on the particular watches that hit our order books, really.
Of course. Excellent. Next question we have, again, anonymous. Do you expect to release the Series 6 anytime soon in 2021?
Probably not. I'm always hesitant about sort of releasing dates and so on. Yeah. The watch has now been designed, and I'm happy with the designs, but there is some very definite prototype work that I want to do on that watch before I really, release the full details of the watch. It's a step in a different direction for me, and so yeah, I want to see the watch in metal. I want to see it ticking. Need to make sure that everything is right before I really start to release details of it. So I think this year, I hope that towards the end of this year, I'll start working on the development, on the prototyping of it, and get the piece together early the following year. And then if all goes well, they don't always go well, these watches, but if all does, then we will release more news of it.
Excellent. They are coming thick and fast. If you've got any questions, be sure to pop them in. We'll try and get through as many as possible. And while the video was playing earlier, we spoke behind the scenes, and any of the questions we don't get to, we're going to get Roger onto the Scottish Watches podcast, and we're going to do a questions and answer session there because there is quite a lot coming in. There will be a lot by the end of tonight. Next question is from Martin, and he says, thanks for the presentation, Roger. What advice would you give to an aspiring new watchmaker?
That's a good one. I think the biggest advice I can give you is just to start. And I have spoken to so many people over the years who've asked that very same question. And the making of a handmade watch is a huge, massive undertaking. And I remember reading George's book several times and going into the planning of how I was going to make a watch. And I kept just mulling over this project in my head, terrifying myself as to the enormity of what I was about to do. And really, yeah, the best thing to do is just start. Even if you don't have fully defined designs, you can just start by making the base plate, start by working on the gear train and so on. And I guarantee the first day you cut metal, you'll just forget all the concerns, all the worries, and you'll be thoroughly absorbed in this amazing, amazing sort of world which you'll find yourself in.
Brilliant
So
answer.
yes, just start.
Yep, that is the best answer. That goes for all fields, all hobbies, all trades. People ask us about starting podcasts, starting YouTube. The best thing you can do is take that first step forward. Great advice. Next question we've got is from Ian in not so sunny Glasgow. A local. Good. I read somewhere that you've recently made improvements to your version of the coaxial escapement. Could you tell us what you've done and what the improvements are?
So certainly it's the so now we're using the Mark II version of the escapement, and we've scaled down the escapement, or scaled down the escapement, because I felt that the size of the escapement as it was, we were using a 6 mil diameter escape wheel, sorry. And I felt that the mass of that was causing issues with the escapement, because the heavier the wheel you have, the harder it is for that wheel to accelerate and perform its job, which is to deliver impulse through to the balance wheel. So the Mark II version, the escape wheel diameter is 4.5 millimeters diameter. We've scaled down the lever, scaled down the roller, all to suit. And it's a real transformation. It's an astonishing improvement in performance. And it is just the fact that that escape wheel can accelerate so much faster and deliver that power, even though on the smaller escapement, the distance where the tooth is delivering the power is far less than it would be on the distance of a larger 6 mil escape wheel. So it's interesting, and we're learning all the time. And the Mark II version that we have now, we're not stopping there. There's more improvements that we can make to it, and we can start to tweak the geometry of the escapement to improve its efficiency.
Brilliant. Let's see. Next question is from Jose. What projects are you working on at the moment, and how do you see the future of British watchmaking and the industry as a whole?
So the projects that I have at the moment, well, I mean, actually, I'm sort of in between projects, and the Series 6 is designed. The Series 4 is now up and running, and we're now working on the next, building the next pieces. I'm having various stints in the workshop, and I'm busy casing up watches, and so there's a few watches that I need to get onto and get those cased up, and we need to get those out and delivered. So I'm having a bit of a breather, but the Alliance, which we talked about briefly earlier or mentioned earlier, that's been taking up a lot of my time, and it's just sort of business as usual, really. There's never a dull moment, certainly in watchmaking.
Excellent. Well, I know that we'd kind of scheduled this to be an hour, and we're approaching that mark, if not just gone past it. But if you can hang around, we have a little bit more for you guys to check out tonight. And the first thing is we're going to do a little bit of a deep dive on the Series 4.
So I'm delighted to be able to have this opportunity to show you my very first Series 4 wristwatch. But it's not only my very first Series 4 wristwatch, it's also the 100th R.W. Smith watch to have been made. This Series 4 wristwatch is cased in platinum, and we have a dial which is hand engraved with a floral design to the centre, with hand engine turned apertures and so on. The chapters are made of silver, and they're all engraved and filled with an ink. and then the hands are blued steel. What's unusual about this watch is that it has a triple calendar complication. And the triple calendar displays the day, the month, and also the date around the periphery of the dial. And what's so unusual about this watch is that it has this unique feature of this travelling date aperture. And this is an idea that I had many years ago, and I first launched it in 2015 at Salon QP. The reason for me creating this aperture is that in traditional triple calendar complications, you tend to have a date hand, which radiates out from the centre of the dial, pointing to the date. But the problem with that is that you then have a hand which sits across key pieces of information for several days at a time. And it's always drummed into me by George that when you're designing a watch, you should design a dial which is very clear, very legible. And this is how we've resulted in the travelling aperture. The watch has taken many years to develop. I remember there's one phase where I designed the watch, I started prototyping it, and several months into prototyping, I just realised that the mechanism, no matter how much effort I put into it, it simply wasn't going to work. So all my designs were scrapped, and I began the design process again with a completely fresh and different approach to achieving this travelling date aperture. The reverse of the watch, you can see the mechanism, and it's finished in my traditional sort of English finish, which is gold plated, and we have flame blued screws. We have this plaque which says the 100th R.W. Smith, and this is a gold plaque which we've fixed to this particular watch. So it's a very important watch in the history of my watchmaking career, and really is a culmination of many years of work. Another key feature of this watch is a coaxial escapement, and this coaxial escapement is my Mark II version, and I began developing the coaxial escapement back in 2006 after I first fitted it into my Series 2 wristwatch, and we've been developing this coaxial escapement ever since. And what we've learnt over this long development period is that it's an incredibly efficient escapement, and I would say that it is probably the world's most mechanically efficient wristwatch escapement being made today. When George invented the coaxial escapement in 1976, I think it was, he knew that the watch was very efficient. There's no doubt about it. He knew that the escapement was very efficient and more efficient than the lever escapement, but is unable to prove that. And the reason why was very simply because he only created 8 watches which housed his coaxial escapement. All of these watches were different. And so he wasn't able to, I suppose, build up a body of work that was able to prove how efficient it was over and above the lever escapement. But what we've been able to do in these 90 odd watches that we fitted the escapement is we've had a standardized movement that we've then been able to gauge the improvements of the coaxial escapement in. And that's been really key to where we are today. So what does it mean to the watch? Our watches, they have a service interval of about 15 years, which is way above the industry standard. And we're hoping to improve on that. And the reason why we're able to offer that 15 years service interval is very simply because of the coaxial escapement, which is very energy efficient. It's also not reliant upon the use of oil, or if we do use oil, then as the oil degrades, then it doesn't affect the rate of timekeeping. But because of this work we've done on the coaxial escapement and the weakening of the mainspring that we use in the watch, that has a knock-on effect in terms of the power that goes through the watch. And if we have a weaker spring, then it means there's less degradation of any lubricant that you can use in the watch. And less wear and tear of the gears, less wear and tear of the pivots, and it means that we've been able to extend this service interval hugely. And so I hope you've enjoyed my little introduction into the Series 4 wristwatch and the coaxial escapement. For me, this has been a huge journey. For me, my watchmaking is all about the improvement of the mechanical timekeeper. That's my driving force, and that's something which George Daniels instilled into me many, many years ago. He said that we can all make watches, but what you have to do is try and make a difference. And in order to keep people interested in watchmaking, you have to try and keep making improvements and so on. And so I hope in some small way this Series 4 and the work we've done with the coaxial escapement has gone some way to continuing the story of the mechanical wristwatch.
And we're back. Hope you guys enjoyed that. For anyone that's just joining us, because people are coming and joining the party tonight as we continue, just to let you know, we are doing everything COVID safe. We are not in a studio, we're all working from home here. Roger's an Isle of Man, and I'm over here in Scotland, so if things are a little bit ropey with connections, 4G and whatnot, that's the reason for it. Now, before we ran that video there, we were talking about the Alliance, and you said this has been taking up a lot of your time. So can you explain a little bit about what the time's been spent on and how things have been going generally?
Yeah, so it's, I mean, as you can imagine, with anything like this, a new organisation like the Alliance, it's taken a huge amount of backroom work and building a team, building a great team to be able to hopefully sort of provide the long-term benefits to the British watch and clock sector, manufacturing sector. So there's been, I mean, particularly last year, there were endless Zoom calls. Seem to be permanently on Zoom calls, and just working out how to structure the whole organization and so on. And as I say, just to provide the support. And we launched in November of last year, and we now have over 50 trade members, which has completely overwhelmed us. At no point in the past has anyone had any idea as to the size and scope of the watch and clockmaking sector within Britain. So it's hugely exciting, and we'll be building on that with the Bellwether report, which we'll be sending out to our trade members in the next couple of weeks. So it's, yeah, there's lots going on, but it's exciting. It's very rewarding.
Yeah, definitely. Well, we've had a lot of response from people that have joined, just enthusiasts who want to find out more, get involved and support what's happening. And you mentioned there, 50 plus different makers, brands and companies. That's a lot of content for us to focus on here within the UK, as well as everything we do throughout the world. So absolutely fantastic. So happy that it's gone so well. We've got a lot of questions coming in. Please keep them coming in as well. And we've got a few to do with the Series 4. But the most important question I've seen popping up so far is from somebody called Mark, and he's asking, do you think that my iPhone could be fitted with a coaxial escapement? Asking for a friend.
Well, I would always say where there's a will, there's a way, and I'll give you a call later, Mark.
Cool.
So,
right.
Thank you.
Next question, probably a little bit more serious, from Per Vinding is, do you make your own numerals? And if so, what technique is used to cut something that small?
So we use, you may have seen in the earlier clip, we use CNC machinery to make some of the small components. And yeah, I mean, we have to make it on that type of equipment just because of the precision that's required. When you're working down to thousandths of a millimeter and you need some sort of repeatability, that for me is the only way to do it. And every single numeral that we, particularly on the open dials, we have these numerals, and on the back are sometimes 2, sometimes 3 feet, which are, I think, about 0.25 of a millimeter in diameter and 0.6 of a millimeter long. So yeah, it's the only real way to get the real accuracy and precision that we need, or I need, for my watches.
Excellent. Next question from John Lilly is, what's the average time to create and build a watch?
It really does depend. I mean, it depends on the complexity. The Series 4 was a huge project, and I came up with a concept back in 2014, and then I launched it at Salon QP in 2015, and here we are in 2021, and we've just delivered our very first pieces. So they can be very big projects. I mean, huge projects, and that particular piece was designed a couple of times, redesigned because of the direction I was going in was wrong. So that all had to be sorted out. And obviously I've got other projects which are going along, other watch projects, development of other pieces and work in the workshop and so on. So it really does depend. I'd say that probably the shortest period has been anywhere from 18 months up to the lengthy Series 4 period, which is sort of, where are we at now? 6, 7, 8 years.
Yeah, good. And we have a question in regards to the alliance itself from someone anonymous. Overall, what's the ultimate aim of the British Watch and Clockmakers Group or Alliance compared to other major institutes in the UK?
Yeah, so in the UK, we have the British Horological Institute and the Worshipful Company of Clockmakers, and they just have very different aims. The BHI is sort of involved in education, and they have a museum at Upton Hall, and it's more orientated towards the repairers and makers of clocks and so on, and watches. And the clockmakers focus is, I mean, they have a wonderful museum at the Science Museum, within the Science Museum, sorry. And again, they tell the story of British watch and clockmaking right from the very beginning through to more recent times. And the Alliance's focus is purely on the trade, purely on what's going on today in British horology, and how can we improve the current situation of British watch and clockmaking. So how can we engage with educators? How can we engage with the engineering that goes on in Britain? How can we encourage British engineers to start to look at the British watch and clockmaking sector and perhaps start to support it? We're looking at careers, we're looking at building careers. So the scope is very wide, and it's going to be a big job, but we have plenty of time and there's huge amounts of enthusiasm to try and improve on this current situation with British watch and clockmaking.
Brilliant. Got a question here I quite like the looks of, and it's from Xander. He asks, what do you think the maximum service interval could ultimately be? And I've seen, perhaps it was Zenith, maybe Panerai, that were talking about 50 years, 70 years, things like that. What are your thoughts on it?
It's very difficult. I mean, if it's the Zenith I'm thinking of, then that's one of these pieces which is made out of predominantly silicon, I believe. So it's a very different animal than a mechanical watch. At the moment, we sort of expect our watches to go for about 15 years without a service, and that's against the industry, which I think is sort of 5-8 years ish, round about there. So we're already trying to push that forward, and that's due to the work that I've done on the development of the coaxial escapement, and it's had knock-on effects for the development of the mechanism as a whole. So will we ever get up to 50 years? Well, I mean, there's work to be done with the nanotechnology. I'm not sure, but I probably won't be around either to tell you. But it's just a long, gradual chip away. And the focus that I have is very much a continuation of George's, which is a continual improvement to the mechanical timekeeper. That's my main focus. And that's what keeps me engaged day in, day out.
Fantastic. You mentioned nanotechnology, and that is a pretty good segue for what we have coming up just now.
Another area that we're looking at is nanotechnology, and this is a new exciting development, and hopefully something which may make a difference to watchmaking. So nanotechnology is a method of adding, it's described as a dry lubricant. So basically what you have is you'd have a pivot which would rotate within a jewel hole, and you'd get what's called platelets, which will have a sort of a magnetic repulsion to each other. And it's this magnetic repulsion which will repel and hold the pivot off from the wall of the jewel hole. And this is something that we're looking into now. And in fact, we've got a watch here which has the very first nano-coated escape wheel. This is actually a lever escapement, a standard lever escapement. And we thought, well, we'd better try it on a inefficient escapement so that we can gauge to see if there are actually any real benefits to trying nano in wristwatches. So we're working with Manchester Metropolitan University and still in the very early stages, but as I say, we're now at the point where we're able to start testing components into watches. So the long-term possibilities, well, who knows? It's we're still in the development phase, and if we're successful, then I think our ultimate goal is to completely remove lubrication from a complete watch. So for me, it's very exciting, and there's still a lot of work to do, still a lot of different materials we can be trying, but we are now on the way.
And we're back once again. Now, the questions have not stopped coming since we basically started this event tonight, and there are so many of them. We're going to try and cram through as many as possible. And as I mentioned earlier, any we miss out, we're going to try and do a podcast on the Scottish Watches channel, basically going through these things with Roger so that no one is missed out, but there'll be more details about that later on. So let's quickly get to the questions. We've got Giovanni asking, greetings from Ecuador. I saw your employees wearing a Christopher Ward in the video. I own 3 myself. How do you see the British microbrand industry going forward?
I think it's got, there's great energy there. I mean, it really is wonderful energy. And the fascinating thing for me is that the modern or today's watchmaking, British watchmaking or clockmaking, it's not come from a traditional British background of horology. It's people coming in from outside of the trade. And so I think it has a huge amount to offer. And that's certainly evident with the Christopher Ward watches and what they're doing. And they have a manufacturing facility in Switzerland and producing excellent watches. And I think it's sort of a modern day British success story. And it's, yeah, I mean, as we start to learn more about these brands which have joined the alliance, I mean, that for me will be the exciting thing, because there's lots that I still have to learn and want to learn about, and there's some very interesting stories out there.
Perfect. Next question we have is from Jack. He asks, which complication would you absolutely love to design and create for a future series of your wristwatches?
I think certainly a chronograph is on my bucket list of things to do. I'm a big fan of the chronographs and have quite a few vintage pieces which I enjoy. I don't know what it is. I think it's the layout of the dial which attracts me, combined with the functionality of the mechanisms. So yeah, I mean, a chronograph is certainly on the list. And again, I'll just try and do something different, something that stands out as being a very British sort of approach to chronograph making.
Excellent. And questions regarding the nano stuff that we just talked about there in the video. If the research proves successful, when do you think we might see the first nano-coated watch?
That's the $1 million question, isn't it? I mean, sadly, because of the COVID situation, particularly in the UK, you know, everything's virtually ground to a halt on that. We're still having occasional contact with them, and we recently received some components which we are now testing in the watches, which you've seen we're now testing in the watches. But there's a long way to go, Rikki, and we just need to get through the COVID situation. It'd be very nice if we could see something in sort of 2022, but certainly please don't hold me to that.
We would, don't you worry. Next question we have is, do you believe that you will be able to remove all of the oil and lubricant from a watch mechanism in the future?
Again, that's very difficult, with particular areas like that. I am in the hands of the scientists, because all I can do is report back and discuss how the watches have performed and where I think the weaknesses are. And I believe that there are different types of coatings for different stress points or within a fine mechanism. So it's a matter of then working with the scientists to be able to create more suitable sort of nano coatings that we can apply to the parts. So it's it'd be great if we could, but who knows? We have a long way to go, I think.
Yeah. Matt asks, it's previously been reported that you intend to start work on the unfinished Daniel's pocket watch in the Clockmakers Museum. Any update on this, please?
It's yes, still very much in the hands of George's trust, his educational trust, and the hope is, yes, that I will do that, but until they've signed off and are happy with the whole process, then we just need to wait to see, really. But if it does come my way, it'll be very exciting. I mean, I remember watching George building that watch, and he started actually working on it during my time with him on the Millennium Project, and within a couple of months he was starting to build that piece. So sadly he never got to finish it, but I sort of lived with it for many years, and it was great to see it completed and finished.
Giovanni, who asked the question earlier, follows up with, where can someone like me who doesn't live within the UK buy your watches?
Contact Caroline. So Caroline is my wife, and she deals with all the backroom office and the orders and so on. So please just go onto our website, and you'll find an email address for Caroline. Please send her an email, and we'd be happy to discuss.
As easy as that. Brilliant.
As easy as that. Yep.
As easy as that.
Yep.
BCU Horology asks, hi Roger, watching from the BCU Horology workshop, you mentioned George Daniels used a lathe to cut jewels. What tools did he use for this? Because it sounds difficult.
Yeah, well, hello everyone at the BCU workshop. It's good to have you all viewing this. And so to answer the question, he used a watchmaker's lathe, an old single pedestal watchmaker's lathe, and he used copper discs, which he loaded with a diamond paste, which then, once mixed with oil, it produces a cutting action. And he basically just used to slice up larger pieces of sort of synthetic carborundum and cut away at the jewels until he got the size and style that he wanted. He didn't really make jewel holes often because they were more readily available, but what he did used to make were the escapement jewels, particularly for the coaxial, because they weren't a standard type of escape wheel. So he would have been able to adapt maybe an existing jewel to suit or something like that. But yeah, it's all it's difficult, but it's again just something that you have to learn.
Perfect. Well, we've almost come to the end of the time we have available just now. So many questions in, so many questions answered. The remainder we will try and get through on a quick episode of the podcast that we will bring out shortly. But we want to let you know about the next event we've got planned. Hopefully everyone's out of lockdown, hopefully within the UK, hopefully the Isle of Man and everywhere else things are looking a little bit rosier. And that is going to be in June, fingers crossed. It's going to be with one of the world's top clockmakers, Bob Bray at Sinclair Harding. So keep your eyes peeled for more information on that one coming soon. And before we finish up, Roger, have you got any sort of parting words?
Yes, well, I'd like to thank the team behind all this, but also I'd like to thank Sean and Ed in the workshop who did a brilliant job of explaining their watches. And also I'd like to thank A Collected Man for enabling us to put on this event, and the support has been greatly appreciated. So thank you.
Perfect. Well, that is great. Thanks for everybody for tuning in. This was a long time in the making. We'd hoped to do something in January, but unfortunately, you know how things went, and it was touch and go up until even a couple of hours ago there with the 4G connectivity issues that Roger was having, and my next door neighbour fitting laminate flooring. But thanks for coming along, and we will look forward to catching you guys in the next one. Thank you. Thank you.